All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Opposite of Cheating podcast. This time I am joined by Tim Fawns, who is on the faculty at Monash, and in another Australian colleague. You'll notice that I keep having Australians on the podcast, and that's because they are, as I've said before, ahead of the game in many sense of the word compared to at least those of us in North America, and they're doing such great work and such resources, I think, being put into how do we teach and assess with integrity. So, Tim, thank you for joining us, and for Tim, it's a Saturday morning.
Thanks very much, Tricia. Yeah, I'm joining you on a Saturday due to my own incompetence in working out time zones, but that's fine. That's fine. It's as good as a Friday these days.
Yeah,
Working with gathering.
it's always a good time for a conversation with a colleague who cares as much about this topic as you do, I think. So tell us, Tim, a little bit more about what you do in what context, because I think it's a bit different than what we might have here, right?
Yeah, quite possibly. So I'm an associate professor at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I work in what's called the Monash Education Academy, which is part of the learning and teaching team in the center of the university. And my role is really to help educators at Monash develop and be recognized for good educational practice. A really wide range of practices, so ranging from teaching and design, assessment, evaluation, and pretty much everything in educational research. And my educational research has mostly been at the intersection of digital education and clinical education. So prior to working at Monash, I worked at the University of Edinburgh in the section of clinical education, teaching on a master's in clinical education, but doing research on digital education within that context. And because of the digital education background and my kind of grounding in technology and education, I'm also heavily involved at Monash in our response to generative artificial intelligence.
Right.
And to some extent, that involves helping people navigate assessment reform at Monash, which is probably why I'm hopefully relevant to your podcast.
Yeah. Well, you definitely are. In fact, I know you work with Phil Dawson. You've worked with Phil Dawson before, and he's already been a guest on our podcast. And so we love talking to folks that have that assessment expertise because I don't know, I think in most PhD programs around the world, we do not do a good job of teaching people how to be teachers or how to design valid assessments, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's right. Higher education is a strange animal in that it often doesn't require a qualification to teach in it. So I think that creates issues for us. If I think about this current context of trying to deal with generative artificial intelligence, like, for me, one of the biggest obstacles is a widespread lack of training in how to be a good teacher, which would help people kind of navigate this
Yeah.
context.
Is it possible for you to move your mic closer to you at all? You're cutting in and out sometimes.
Sorry, I'll move myself closer to my mic, I
Perfect,
think.
perfect. Yeah, no, and I wonder if that's one thing that we're going to finally reckon with and change. Will we start to recognize that teaching is really hard and you can't just teach because you're an expert in your discipline? And do you think we'll start to doing teacher-like training for folks who want to enter the professorship? Or are you talking about that at all in Australia?
Yeah, we're talking about it a lot. We're not making huge moves. I mean, higher education moves slowly.
Yes.
I think we are, yeah, I think we are recognizing the need for educational expertise more and more. And I think we're recognizing the need to try to help educators prepare for that. But we have a bit of a job to do in terms of the systems and the
Yeah.
infrastructures and the support and the workload models. Because the risk is that we just add more work onto people's already very
Right.
busy lives. And actually learning about education is really hard
Yeah.
work. There's a lot to it. So we need to be a little bit careful about how we introduce these new requirements.
Yeah. I mean, I think about Western Governors University, which is a virtual university here in the States, and the professors at least are not the ones who design the assessments. They use assessment experts who design the assessments, and they kind of keep the facilitating learning part separate from the assessing learning part. So I don't know
I'm
if
I'm
that's a model we think we should all go towards.
I'm torn on this. I hear similar thoughts floating around, and what troubles me is that I feel like I want educators to be sort of involved in the whole student. So
Mm,
I don't like the idea that you're teaching people and you're not actually assessing you're not really assessing them as you go. So you don't really know how effective your teaching is, but
true.
also you don't have as clear a sense of what your students are learning, and you're not so involved in the feedback. And when you know your students and when you have a better sense of their progression, you can attune your conversations, your dialogue,
Yeah.
the feedback that students um, are engaging with around their learning. So I feel like the separation of those can be a bit problematic, and it can also create the situation where people get so focused on this assessment that you are really spending all of your time trying to
Teach.
make sure your students are prepared for that assessment that you don't have any control over, rather than being able to design things in a way that you think suits your specific context and your students.
No, that's a good point because that's what we've experienced here in the K through 12 arena with standardized testing is teachers teaching to the test. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, we'll talk more about assessment after we ask and answer the I think the most interesting, fun question of our episodes, which is what's your first memory of encountering this idea, philosophy, value of academic integrity?
That is an interesting question. I think if you want to talk about when I first encountered it as that phrase, academic
Yeah.
integrity, that's probably not until I was working in higher education, which for
Mhm.
me was at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, United Kingdom, which was mostly for me around plagiarism in assignments.
Yeah.
And
UK was obsessed only with plagiarism for a long time.
yeah, that's right. And so I never thought about academic integrity as a student. I only ever thought of it as a member of staff. I thought, there was cheating, but that's different.
Yeah.
Um,
As we say, it's
and
the opposite of cheating. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Um, and plagiarism was such a huge deal.
Yeah.
And then Turnitin brought in its originality report, um, and that reshaped the landscape because it allowed educators to kind of, I don't know, park their worries a little bit and just assume that Turnitin would handle it for them.
Hmm.
And all of the weird conversations about, well, it's fine to use Turnitin even though it foregrounds distrust. And there's a great paper that came out of University of Edinburgh, my colleagues Jen Ross and Hamish McLeod talking about Turnitin and the foregrounding of distrust, and how uh, making all students submit their work through Turnitin was a way of putting this technology between the interface of students and educators. And rather than submitting your work to your teacher,
Mm,
you submitted it to this cold interface that decided whether you cheated or not, and
mm,
then that's what the teachers could see. Um, but there was this weird side conversation where the use of Turnitin could be justified as something that helped you with your academic integrity, because the students could use it to make sure that their academic
mm,
writing had integrity in it, which I'm skeptical of.
hmm.
Um,
Me too.
so if you want to know about when did I think about cheating, then it was, that's at primary school when you see a kid sneak a look at someone else's work, or someone asks someone else to do their assignment for them. And I remember thinking, I was trying to think through this question of whether it's more important to get a good mark or do the right thing. And I remember at some point realizing it wasn't clear cut at all, because there seemed to be more or less socially and morally acceptable forms of transgressing a rule and certain things that felt more wrong or more okay than others. And so I think my sense of academic integrity, though I didn't use those words, was forming the question of how do you make those judgments and decisions about what to do that are contingent on both what feels okay and how likely it is that you might get caught or might suffer negative
Yeah.
consequences. Yeah, but then it sort of became this phrase, academic integrity, when working in higher education, which I think really gets conflated with cheating. I mean, you know that because you started this podcast.
Yeah.
But it's so weird because they really are the opposite. Like, and academic integrity is just one part of integrity. And integrity, it should be there whether you're being watched or not.
Yeah.
And as educators, we should be preparing people, helping people cultivate that sort of integrity, which I think some of the ways in which we deal with academic integrity actually do the opposite of that.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's dig into that a bit more. So I agree, and it's complicated, right? So when I first started this job 19 years ago, I wanted to, I would say we want to graduate, we want our graduates to make the right choice, even if nobody's watching, right? And so that means teaching good, ethical decision making and helping them give voice to values and all that kind of stuff. And I still believe that. I still believe that's one of a durable human skill that we should be teaching people is how to think and act ethically, right? And 2025 is very different in that, back in 1999 when or 99, I was long past being a student, but back in the 90s, before the internet, when I was a student, it was much harder to cheat. I would have had to be proactive, right? I would have had to write it on my arm, which is not hard, but it's hard not to get caught. I would have had to ask Tim to sit beside me so I could copy from him from the exam because I knew he was smarter than me. I'd have to ask somebody for their homework or their paper to copy from, right? You had to kind of be more proactive. And now students are invited to cheat by contract cheating companies, by AI companies. I mean, Perplexity Comet is advertising themselves as a cheating service to students. And it's hard not to cheat. Like you have to make a lot of decisions to not cross that line. And so now I think in a way it's a dereliction of our duty to um, expect students to be able to make the right choice when no one's watching. And I think I'm thinking it's very similar to anytime a human has a value or a goal they are trying to reach, and say it's getting healthy, and say you have a sweet tooth. You're going to rid your kitchen of sugar, right? You're not going to buy donuts, put them
Yeah.
on the counter, and force yourself to stare at them. And so we need to do things for our students to help them achieve the goal that they've set out to, and to do it even when it's difficult, right? To provide them some guardrails. So, what do you think about that? And then I want to talk to you about how authentic assessments fits into that landscape. But first, what do you just think
Yeah,
of my premise?
I agree with your premise, but it's really, really complicated because um, I think sometimes we try to set those conditions within formal aspects of higher education, but we can't really reach into the informal aspects of
Mhm.
higher education to take away the sugar,
Yeah,
because so much is going on outside of
supervision. Mm,
that. Yeah, and that the boundary of study versus doing the work of assessment, and when does an assessment start?
mm,
Um, because before the assessment starts, we can't do or possibly shouldn't do all that much to stop people from doing things. And the boundary between personal life and study is really blurry. I'm
mhm,
part of a cross-institutional research project called AIinHE.org, looking at student perspectives on artificial intelligence with colleagues from University of Queensland, Deakin University, University of Technology Sydney. And what we're seeing is all of the pressures that are acting on
yeah.
students and all of the complexity of their work life, their kind of multiple identities as students, but
Mhm.
also parents and carers and friends and
Workers.
employees.
Yeah.
um, sometimes educators as
Hmm.
well, and how it things look different from these different identities and the sort of long term and short term views. I'm worried about using AI, but I end up using it because the workload pressures are
Yeah.
so great that I need to. But at the same time, I'm worried about the long term implications on my learning.
Yeah.
It's a real mess. And so it's really hard, I think, for us to control this situation.
Yes, agreed. And that's life, though, right? So again, take anything that we have to do in our life or that we set out that we want to do. So, um, I I really don't want to eat that hamburger, but I don't have time to make something healthy, or I don't have the funds
Yes.
to make something healthy,
Or
and
it's cheaper.
or it's cheaper, and so I need to eat. So that is a dilemma that's not unique to students, right? And so I'm
Mhm.
just trying to figure out, and if we think about the durable human skills we want to develop in folks to live in an AI powered world or augmented world or dominant world, we are not sure yet how it's going to turn out. That seems to be one of them. And yeah, so that kind of gets us to authentic assessments. Authentic assessments are something that could help students develop durable human skills, right? They really want to focus on fostering critical thinking and because they're authentic assessments, at least this is how I define them, in raise intrinsic motivation because they're meaningful and they're relevant and they're not just the 5 paragraph essay that people have been writing for a hundred years, right? And I know a lot of faculty want to hang their hats on those, especially faculty that teach online, especially faculty who teach online asynchronous classes. They really want to hang their hat on that and hope that that's the magic bullet. And I know, to the cheating problem, and I know you have written about this, and I know Australia talks about authentic assessments a lot. So, what are authentic assessments good for, and what are they not good for? And do you agree with my
Thanks.
kind of definition of my very broad, vague definition of what they are?
Well, I mean, there are a few definitions floating around. I'm happy with yours, relevant and meaningful, because sometimes it's defined as mirroring real world practices. And I don't really subscribe to the idea that there's a real world outside of university.
Right.
And because, you know, university is part of the real world. It might be a
Are.
funny part of the real world. And also there isn't this like uniform real world context that you
Right.
can mirror because you're preparing students for infinite possible
Yes.
futures and you don't know what they are. Um, so if we think about it as in terms of relevance and meaningfulness, then that also depends on the student because
Right.
what is relevant to them. So to me, that suggests that they need a little bit of choice and
Choice
agency
control.
and
Mhm.
ownership. And then that, of course, is a bit tricky for this whole academic integrity thing because, well, it's not tricky for academic integrity, but it's tricky for assurance of learning and
Yes.
assessment security because you have less control if you're allowing students to make choices. So then it really, there's no evidence that just doing authentic assessment prevents cheating. And partly that's because who decides that an assessment is authentic? Some people think that scenario-based multiple choice exams are authentic assessment, and other people think that if you introduce AI, so you let students use AI in their assessment, that's authentic because you know AI is
Sure.
in the industry and
Yeah.
in society. But like just using AI isn't authentic. It really depends on um, what you're doing, and a use of AI doesn't represent all the uses of AI that you might need to encounter. So it's a funny, messy space. Um, and the problem that we identify in that paper, which I think is called something about, let me just look.
I have it up
It's,
here. Authentic assessment from panacea to criticality.
thank you. It's not even a long title, but I couldn't
No.
remember. What the issue is that it's actually really hard to design a good authentic assessment. And the design complexity is really important because you always have trade-offs. So what is the purpose of your assessment? What are the purposes? Because there's
Right.
always multiple, and what are you trying to do? If you're trying to reduce cheating, then really, we argue, you need to design an assessment that's aimed at reducing cheating.
Yeah.
If you are wanting to design an assessment that's authentic, you really need to aim your design at the authenticity, which doesn't in and of itself deal with the cheating problem.
Right.
I do agree, though, that if you can increase intrinsic motivation to do interesting work, that should help, but it's
Yeah.
certainly not a panacea, and you cannot guarantee that any given student cares enough or has the bandwidth or is
Yeah.
has the sort of living conditions to be able to take on that, and just do the work in a, a rich and authentic way, just because you did a good design. So you will still need this sort of multifaceted approach where you do a good assessment design and you help the students engage with it. I think that's also an important piece in education is our curriculum design and our teaching set up to really help the student engage with this assessment in the way that we want them to.
Yeah.
Isn't just about the assessment conditions.
Yeah. And that makes me think of I just spent 2 hours with a group of folks at a community college here in California, and about 41% of their courses are online. They didn't know the breakdown between synchronous or asynchronous, and it's because coming out of the pandemic, people expected it, wanted it. It's about convenience, it's about access, but it's not necessarily about learning. And so, if authentic assessment can maybe increase intrinsic motivation, but then you've also got to support the students through their bandwidth issues and all the other things you just said, is that even possible in an online asynchronous class? Should we be should we be finally saying like this modality does not meet 2025 in terms of what students really need from colleges or universities?
So let me work my way into this because I need to be careful here because for me, on fully online courses are a necessity. We need to have them. They need to be part of the education ecosystem for various equity reasons.
Okay.
In Australia, that might include regional people needing to be able to access a university education without having to travel, or
Having to
people with care
move.
and responsibilities, mobility issues, the bringing together of international students without having to make them move across the world, and the richness of that. I'm also really lucky because I've studied and taught fully online
Mm,
programs, and those have been the best educational experiences I've seen, and I've
mm,
seen quite a lot. Because if you are good at designing them and facilitating them, they're really, really rich. And often you do put a lot of energy when you're running an online program into making sure there's a strong community, a strong presence, a strong sense of relationships between students and teachers and students, and that includes fully asynchronous
okay.
courses. I've had some amazing fully asynchronous course experiences as a student and an educator. Um, so you can certainly do the authenticity bit, and partly that is because an online course is a little bit like a base camp for me. You come together and you talk about what you're going to do and what's important, and then you can kind of go leave the computer and go and do something authentic and then bring it back for a discussion, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So actually online learning can tackle a lot of things that people kind of assume that it can't because they think that the learning happens inside a computer, which it doesn't.
Right, right.
Um, the the challenge that's being put to online courses, and particularly asynchronous ones at the moment, is really about observation of what students are
Yeah,
doing,
validating the
uh,
learning.
validating the learning.
Yeah.
And um, at the moment, fully asynchronous courses, I I think they are struggling to meet the standard that we need to be sure that the student is who they say they are and that they are learning what we say they're learning.
Yeah.
But as I said in a conversation the other day, I think we can't write off the entire modality
Yeah.
on the basis of what we know about it and what we currently are able to think through because things change. So, for example, um, online learning's had this big roller coaster.
Yes.
There were pockets of people doing amazing work in online learning. Then we had COVID lockdowns, and then online learning was apparently terrible, even though it was actually much better than on-campus learning because on-campus learning gave you a risk of death, and online learning didn't. So it won that battle in my view,
Right.
but it still got
Well, it was emergency remote teaching for many people. Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Emergency remote teaching, which is not the same as
Yeah.
thoughtful
Right.
online learning. But still, people saw value in preserving some of that as we went
Yes.
on, and now it's under attack again.
Yes.
Um, so I think it's contingent on us to try to think of ways of doing this that we can be satisfied with. I think it's okay for synchronous online learning because you can have check-in points and meaningful encounters with students over a long period of time in a lot of different ways, looking at a lot of different forms of learning, generate evidence of the application of knowledge in different tasks in engagement with peers and teachers, collate
Yeah.
that into some sort of portfolio, evaluate it holistically, and the assessment security is never 100%, but be kind of satisfied that this is reasonably coherent argument that this student has demonstrated the learning that we needed them to do over the program.
Yeah.
Um, it's not easy to do that, especially with the workloads that everyone's got, but it's
Right.
possible. And therefore, I think you don't want to write off online learning. And also, on-campus assessment security is increasingly under threat through wearable technology. So I think if you scrap online learning and then suddenly you realize that on-campus isn't any stronger in a couple of years, then what do you do? Do you try and reinvigorate online learning? And so the same is true for asynchronous online learning. I think although we in general are not meeting the standards or possibly nowhere are meeting the standards that we need to assure learning at the moment, I think that's also a question of imagination and technology
Yeah.
advancement. We need to think through this because there are reasons to preserve that type of education, in part just so that we don't skew everything towards a particular form of assessment
Yeah.
that we think is more secure, but actually skews the type of learning that's valued through education.
Yeah. I appreciate that. What I've been trying to encourage folks to do, both here and wherever I talk, is to decouple our language because we can get pretty conflated. And so when we say online learning versus in person, that's actually not a great helpful distinction because in-person classes also a lot of them have online asynchronous unsupervised assessments, right? And so I'm suggesting we let's talk about online asynchronous unsupervised assessments as the thing that needs to be solved, not online learning. People can learn online all the time. People learn 24/7. Online, right? Does that make sense to you?
Totally. So
Yeah.
in
Okay.
2019, I published a paper called Post-Digital Education in Design and Practice, which makes the argument that there isn't a clear distinction between on-campus and online,
Right.
um, and that it's a really problematic distinction, and blended learning is even more problematic because all education is
Yeah.
blended learning. The assessment question is exactly right. I think that
Okay.
the problem is not that it's a fully online course, it's that the assessment component is done without observation,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Great.
or direct observation, if you like.
We'll include that 2019 article in the show notes too. Um, I'm finding that people react to that very well because I often say, there's a lot of online classes masquerading as in-person classes right now. If they podcast their lectures, if all the assessments are online asynchronous, if there's no interaction going on in the classroom, it might as well be online, right? If you're not having the humans interact with other humans, then it is an online class in terms of in a you know what I mean. So um yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, but I do think you're right, and I do think that we also need to keep evolving um, who we are and what we're here for as universities, because we used to be existing both our original of our online learning, our correspondence or distance ed, however language you want to use, and even just our physical universities themselves were the holders of all knowledge information. People had to come to us to access books. I mean, there was no other way to access the knowledge. You couldn't get the book from your public library. I mean, you literally the universities kind of had all that. And that's just not our service. That's not our value add anymore, right? And so what is our
Yeah.
value add? Have you thought, and maybe we'll make this the last question and wrap up. Are you looking ahead to let's stick away from assessment for the second. Are you looking ahead to online learning in terms of VR or AVR or anything, and how that might change what online, I knew this was going to happen, what online learning, and will that help,
So
do you think?
I guess that is part of my argument that if you say online learning is no good for this or can't do this, then you might be wrong in 2 years.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
because it's a modality. It's not an approach, it's not a technology,
Right.
and it can develop. I mean, we've seen massive developments over the last 5 years and 10
Yeah.
years and 15 years. So I think that is a really interesting question. You almost asked me what the point of higher education was there, which was a
Yeah.
terrifying thing to end on. But I do
I,
think
I
that
want your answer. Your
well, I do think that you're right that we need to be a little bit careful. Like if we put all our eggs in the assurance and academic integrity basket, then we are at risk of forgetting some of
yeah.
the other really important parts of education, and those are to do with relationships and identity
Yes.
building. That's the whole person and tackling complex problems.
With
And
a usually.
if we ignore those bits, then we're at risk of doing ourselves out of a job because other providers can
Yep.
do this kind of assurance bit. So when we do develop things like AR and VR and simulation and new takes on authenticity and all of the kind of really interesting possible things, then I think we need to bear that in mind that what what could higher education do that other people couldn't do? And I think it has to do with those kind of woollier aspects. And as I've been talking to a lot of people about generative artificial intelligence, if you weren't so worried, and I totally get why we're worried, we have to protect the validity of our qualifications. But if we weren't quite as worried, we might be able to have fascinating conversations about
Mm,
what does this mean for learning, for disciplinary knowledge, for education, for
mm.
society. And so I kind of hope that new technologies that are introduced can help us be curious about the world in a way that isn't always pinning it down to whether someone met a learning outcome, but just being able to explore and have dialogue around. Isn't this fascinating? That what light does this shed on
Mm.
interesting questions? What questions does it raise? But I do understand that balancing that with the need to actually provide particular functions for students and employers and institutions is part of that trade-off, the tensions that I think, and rather than close down those tensions with these panaceas and silver bullets and things, I think we kind of need to hold those tensions and
Yes,
um, and keep them as a sort of guiding light, if you like.
absolutely. And I so appreciate you saying that, because one of my kind of missions is to help university educators and administrators and all of us to to realize that a lot of these things that make us feel like we're in a binary are not don't have to be in a binary, don't have to be in opposition, whether that's access and integrity, we can do both, or whether that's curiosity and exploration of problems and validating learning. I think we're smart enough to do both. And so we should keep looking at as Phil Dawson would do in the improv, yes, and yes, that's true. And how do we do both? And I hope that that's the mission that we all continue to have. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining me, especially on a beautiful Saturday morning. And I look forward to maybe doing a follow-up with you in a year and seeing how things are going.
That'd be great. Thanks so much, Tricia.
Thanks, Tim.